Welcome, everyone. We're so happy you're here. This is the Plum Island and Sea Level Rise meeting 2 of 2. It's June 3rd, 2021. I'm Ona Ferguson, here with Elizabeth Cooper and Maggie Ostus from the Consensus Building Institute, and more importantly, part of the project team that have been shepherding this work in the last 9 months or so. And we're going to help keep the conversation flowing and facilitate and help you know how to give input at different points. And I want to, if we can take down the slide for just a second, introduce, everyone can see 9 of us who are here on behalf of the project who have been working hard on this for many moons. And you'll be hearing presentations and introductions from various of us. Just to say, the Consensus Building Institute is a nonprofit based in Boston, and we do facilitation and mediation. So we work on the kind of process and people side and work with committees and facilitate meetings on all kinds of topics, including climate related ones. We have municipal representation from Newbury. Martha Taylor's here, and Newburyport, Andy Port and Julia Gottfredson. Our PI for the project is Ellie Baker from Horsley Witten. We have Tom Dworatsky and Dan Stevens from Communitywide 310 who have done fiscal analysis that they'll be presenting tonight here. And to name, we have also worked with a really active advisory committee since the fall who have helped steer this from both communities. So we're really happy to be here. Ellie, can you put up the slides and I'll just go through the agenda quickly? We are going to take 2 hours for this. Some earlier communications had this ending at 8, but we realized we really wanted to have time to get through the content in a meaningful way with you. So here's what to expect. The times might, adjust one way or another a little bit, but we'll do a welcome. We'll kind of check in on who we have in our virtual room together. And then we'll hear from Ellie, who will give a recap of meeting 1 for those of you who were not able to attend last week or watch the recording. And then we're going to hear the fiscal and economic analysis from Communitywide 310. We will then ask for your takeaways and sort of what you're hearing in all of this and thinking about. And we'd like your input on where we go next. What should the communities be thinking about or doing in coming months and years on all of this? And we will wrap up at 8:30. Again, thank you for being here. We are going to go now to some welcoming words from from our municipal reps, starting with Martha, I believe.
Hi, thanks, Ona. Good evening, and thank you all very much for joining us today. I'm Martha Taylor, Planning Director for the town of Newbury, and I would like to welcome you all to the second of a 2-part series of meetings regarding Plum Island and sea level rise. I hope you were able to attend the first meeting, which Ona just mentioned, and which was held on May 24th, or to view the video, which is available on the project website. If not, I encourage you to go to www.plumislandsealevelrise.com and access the video on the meeting tab. The first meeting provided information on sea level rise and how it's projected to impact Plum Island. Tonight's meeting will focus on the fiscal implications of sea level rise, followed by a discussion of next steps. And we very much look forward to getting your thoughts on all of this. I'd like to mention again that these meetings are being held in connection with a fiscal year 2020-21 Municipal Vulnerability Action Grant that was awarded by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to the town of Newbury in early 2020 to study the fiscal and economic implications of sea level rise on Plum Island. As Ona mentioned, we've been working on this project in collaboration with the city of Newburyport and with a team of consultants, including Horsley Witten as a project lead, Communitywide 310, and the Consensus Building Institute. We began working on this project in February 2020, right before COVID state of emergency was declared, so that had some impact on our process. But through all of that, and with the assistance of a very engaged advisory group, we have been developing the information that was presented at the May 24th meeting and that you will see tonight. As we noted at the last meeting, planning for resiliency for Plum Island has been identified as a high priority in both Newbury and Newburyport. including in the community-driven municipal vulnerability preparedness planning workshops that were held in 2018 for both municipalities. The impact of sea level rise is clearly a regional issue and an issue all up and down the East Coast, but the decision to focus this particular project on Plum Island was a direct outgrowth of both of those MPP planning workshops. At the last meeting, we also noted that our two communities share commercial and residential areas and a wealth of natural resources on the island, all of which are expected to be impacted by projected sea level rise. Both communities have experienced and are continuing to experience significant and in some areas ongoing erosion and damage on the island. For example, right now at the Plum Island Reservation Terrace in Newburyport, as well as flooding during storms and during certain high tide cycles. The severity and frequency of erosion and flooding on the island are expected to get worse in coming years as a result of climate change and sea level rise. And as we saw at the last meeting, the daily impact on the island of high tide cycles is projected to become significant over the next 50 years. We know that planning for the future of Plum Island will require thoughtful analysis as well as collaboration, innovation, creativity, and pragmatism. This project is a collaborative effort between Newbury and Newburyport to develop new information in support of those planning and decision-making efforts. So again, thanks again very much for being here tonight and joining in this important discussion. We look forward to your input. And Andy, turn it over to you.
Thank you, Martha. I actually want to echo much of what Martha has said. Newburyport shares a number of issues with Newbury when it comes to Plum Island. Obviously, the erosion issues, which happen on an ongoing basis. The city also applied for a so-called MVP grant, a Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness grant, to address the same issue, projected sea level rise, as a capital improvement project, which means a construction project. We just completed construction of a revetment or a berm to protect the wastewater treatment facility that serves both communities, using funds from the same grant program. So this is an issue that the state has put some funding into, recognizing it's an issue that's coming along nationally and for New England as well. So Plum Island is a rare land use form in the area. It's a barrier beach, essentially a buffer from the mainland of ocean forces. It often takes the brunt of those forces in the form of erosion. That often involves some shifting around. When we look at the aerial photographs, we can see the shifting around of the beach and the actual shape of the island. The current erosion is in association with the jetty is only a snapshot in a history of these cycles. Now scientists and engineers are projecting that this will get worse and more frequent in future years. So this is consistent, by the way, with projections and preparations that are happening nationally and globally. This is not unique to Newburyport, for instance. We need to prepare for these changes, including more frequent flooding of the primary and sole access point to Plum Island, the Plum Island Turnpike. As could be seen in the prior presentation, we're hitting some of the fiscal analysis this evening, but in the prior presentation, I think those maps are helpful for folks to review. Those maps can also have implications for the extent to which both communities want to encourage further growth and development on the island in light of this info. In either respect, in whatever communities decide to do, both communities or separately decide to do about these issues, we obviously need to do them, in some way coordinated on the island. We appreciate your attending this meeting and learning more about this issue and getting involved to address it for the community going forward. With that, I'm going to pass it back to Elizabeth.
Thanks, Andy. So now that you hopefully have a sense of what we're doing here, we want to just, understanding that we're all in this virtual room together, just get a little bit of a sense of who is in the room with us here together tonight. So in the chat, we're about to put a link to a poll everywhere, which will open in your browser, and you can answer a few questions to help us understand sort of the range of life experiences and backgrounds, perspectives that are coming into this conversation. So first, we're wondering where you live. Do you live on Plum Island on the Newbury or the Newburyport side? Do you live in one of the communities on the quote unquote mainland, or maybe you live in an adjoining community or something else? And then we're asking, what will your age be in 2050, which is 29 years from now? You'll see tonight that in the last meeting when we talked about the sort of sea level rise projections, and tonight when we're talking about the fiscal and economic projections, we're thinking pretty far into the future. So we'd love to kind of get you in the mindset of thinking, what will your life be like 29 years from now? And then how much are climate change impacts in your home community on your mind now? Is it something that you think about all the time, kind of as it comes up when you're involved in this kind of conversation, or are impacts on your own home community not something that you think about that often? We're wondering. And then finally, we're just wondering if you attended or had a chance to watch the recording from last week's session. And it's totally fine if you haven't, but we would just love to know sort of the makeup of the room so we know kind of how much to catch up the group there. So we'll give you all a minute to click that link that Maggie put into the chat and fill out your responses, and Maggie will share the results in just a minute. How are we doing with responses so far, Maggie?
Good. We've got about 20 people done, and 20 people looks like they're kind of in the midst.
Got it. Hopefully you don't have to think too hard about these questions. So, and while we're just waiting for the rest of those responses to come in, I'll just sort of preview. I'm going to turn it over to Ellie Baker in just a second to kind of introduce the project, talk about the purpose, and catch everybody up with the climate projections and other sort of background information that we shared last week. And as we're going through, some of you have already taken advantage of the using Q&A, but as Ellie and then Tom and Dan from Camoin are presenting, feel free at any point to put questions into that Q&A function. We'll try to sort of answer those as we're going along in writing, and then questions that might be sort of relevant to everybody, we will pose them verbally and sort of interject into the conversation so that we make sure everybody's coming along with us. So feel free to use that freely. And then as we get a little bit later into the meeting, we're going to have a real kind of, more discussion-based time. And at that point, you should feel free to raise your hand and make comments verbally as well as through the written tools we have. So Maggie, you want to show us who we've got here?
Of course. A sec.
All right, so it looks like we have a number of residents from the island in both municipalities, number of folks from the mainland, more represented from Newburyport than Newbury tonight, some from adjoining communities and some from elsewhere who are just interested in this conversation. So we welcome all of you, glad you're here. Let's see, next. So many of us will be advanced in age 29 years from now, not a surprise. And we've got some young folks in the room who will only be between 40 and 60 years old at that point, and some in the middle, and some who will be quite far along. Next slide, please. And many of you think about climate impacts for your home community quite often. And some of you, it's sort of occasional as it comes up in the conversation, and nobody is not thinking about it, so I guess fair to say. And Jeff has just asked how many folks are attending. We have 58 attendees at the moment. And most of you did get a chance to watch last week's recording, and some of you haven't. No problem. We're going to try to catch you up as best we can. I think it's still a really rich presentation, and I really encourage you to give it a watch. Gives really good sort of visualization of what we can expect as a future of sea level rise impacts on the island. So I encourage you to take a look at that. And the link to that is posted in the Q&A right now. So with that, let me turn it over to Ellie to kind of set the stage and remind us what got us to this point.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth. Did the screen come back up? You guys can see that okay? Great.
That's great.
Well, I just wanted to give a quick introduction, as I was advised to do at the beginning of this. So I'm Ellie Baker. I'm a senior environmental planner with the Horsley Witten Group. I have over 20 years of professional experience, sort of at the intersection of policy, science, and engineering. And I've been focused on improving the balance between natural systems and community needs, sort of one project at a time. If you're not familiar with Horsley Witten Group, we're a 30-year-old small business planning, engineering, and environmental science consulting firm. We're based in Massachusetts with offices in New Hampshire and Rhode Island as well, along with the US Virgin Islands. And I am based in our Exeter office in Exeter, New Hampshire, but I'm currently working out of my home office in Newburyport. So I'm going to give a little bit of a background or overview recap, I guess, of the prior presentation, just to try to catch people up as much as I can. So just point of focus here, our project focuses on Plum Island, located in northeastern Massachusetts at the mouth of the Merrimack River. The developed portions of Plum Island are located on the northern end of the island in the town of Newbury and Newburyport, and Plum Island Turnpike originates in Newburyport, but essentially crosses through Newbury, and then this entire area at the center of the island and the south of the island is in Newbury, and the northern 2 points are both in Newburyport. The island is served by the city of Newburyport's public water and sewer systems, which is important to understand as you're considering sea level rise and subsequent impacts. So the Plum Island project's goal is to lay the groundwork to better enable both communities to make thoughtful decisions regarding the challenges for long-term planning for Plum Island. Under the guidance of a multi-stakeholder advisory group, as was mentioned earlier, from both communities, as well as state and federal agencies, our technical team made up of Horsley Witten Group, Camoin 310, and the Consensus Building Institute, as well as the planning staff that you met from both communities, has prepared a set of flood projection maps. We've gathered economic and fiscal information, and we've analyzed what changes can be expected as a result of sea level rise in order to help the towns begin to evaluate long-term management outcomes for Plum Island. So this project is really trying to help the communities to address this question on the screen here, which is how can both communities responsibly manage the island with all the public services that accompany that responsibility, and how can both communities prepare for inevitable change? So planning for Plum Island in the face of sea level rise is complicated, we know that, but this project aimed to develop one set of useful information to help inform that planning. We know that Plum Island is at risk, so what do? How do we begin to evaluate management options? How do we know what options might make sense? Well, we know we should begin to weigh some costs and benefits to start to understand some of the municipal fiscal implications of sea level rise. And let's begin to have a discussion as well. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts State Hazard Mitigation and Climate Adaptation Plan presents this summary of sea level rise projections at 4 locations in Massachusetts, with Boston being the furthest northern site. The analysis for Massachusetts, which is primarily based on DeConto and COP 2017, uses a probabilistic assessment of future relative sea level rise at each tide gauge location. This analysis incorporates 2 future atmospheric greenhouse gas concentration pathways, which you may have heard of. The medium pathway is referred to as RCP 4.5 and the high is RCP 8.5, and 2 methods of accounting for Antarctic ice sheet contributions to sea level rise. So our study evaluated conditions following approximately the high scenario, which is what I've highlighted on the screen here, which corresponds to a continuation of the current global greenhouse gas emissions trends. So this is the same scenario that is being used by other Massachusetts agencies to evaluate infrastructure risks from flooding. Year 1 in these projections is based on a 19-year tidal epoch, 1999 to 2017, which is centered around the year 2008. One term that I want to explain is mean higher high water. We evaluated sea level rise as it pertains to mean higher high water, or essentially the average daily high tide. Mean higher high water is the average height of the higher of the 2 daily tides in our region. Studies are showing that mean higher high water, MHHW, is being exceeded more and more often in the Northeast, a sign that sea levels are rising. So for this project, we compiled a series of maps depicting a set of flood projection information for the years 2030, 2050, and 2070. These projection maps include the extent of the mean high water, the extent of the projected 10-year flood, and the extent of the projected 100-year flood. So we also identified areas of elevated erosion risk as indicated by observed erosion rates. So I'll show you on this map, just to orient you as I did in the first meeting, that the mean high water is indicated by this purple boundary. The 10-year flood is indicated by the darker blue boundary. You can see in these call out boxes where these lines are a little bit clearer. And then the lighter blue is the 100-year flood boundary. The areas identified in red are areas that we've identified as higher risk for erosion based on prior studies of erosion rates on the island over the last 30 years, as well as over longer periods of time. However, we do note that we cannot predict exactly where erosion will occur on the island. It's continually changing. So in 2030, the map that you're looking at, the daily high tide is projected to, on average, reach the very edge of the Plum Island Turnpike in certain limited parts of the island. It will extend inland onto some individual properties. This also means that on occasion, the high tide will extend further up onto the roads and into people's properties, causing a more common nuisance. The 10-year flood, represented by the dark blue, extends well inland, particularly on the marsh side of the island. 2030 is 10 years from now. The 10-year flood puts Old Point at significant risk, as well as many homes in Newbury along the western side of the island, along Old Point Road and Sunset Drive. The 10-year flood also isolates the island due to complete flooding over Plum Island Turnpike. Another way of looking at the 10-year flood, which is a common term, is to say that there is a 10% chance that flooding will exceed that extent in any given year. In other words, a 1 in 10 chance. So now you're looking at the projected maps for 2050, 30 years from now. So by approximately 2050, we can expect that the Plum Island Turnpike and main intersection to Plum Island will be overtopped regularly by high tides. According to these projections, Old Point will be overtopped by high tide extending from the basin all the way to the salt marsh in several locations. You can see in this area. This means that roadways, homes, cars, and anything stored under elevated homes will be exposed to saltwater inundation every day. Wind-driven high tides would be even higher. Residents of Plum Island and businesses in the center of the island would be regularly affected by tidal inundation. These homes and businesses would be inaccessible on a regular basis on a schedule that is set by tides, winds, and storms instead of your own personal schedule. And by 2070, 50 years from now, the projections indicate that conditions are likely to be much more dire. The extent of mean high water reaches almost all the way across the center of the island. Combined with erosion on the beach, mean high water could breach the small remaining dune and extend all the way across the width of the island. The green areas, which denote low-lying areas, are likely to be inundated by tidal waters that breach the shore as a result of coastal erosion in 2070, rendering much of North Point flooded at high tide as well. So what does this information mean for our study and for moving forward? These future flood projections, they give us a basis for our analysis and for considering these impacts. How will these future flood and storm impacts be reflected in future fiscal and economic costs and benefits for both communities? We'll hear a little bit about that in our next presentation. We don't know yet exactly what actions to take with regard to Plum Island resilience, but we can examine the potential outcomes and the scale of costs and benefits associated with those outcomes to try to understand the situation a little bit better. So our analysis selected 3 hypothetical outcomes on Plum Island in order to assess the potential impacts of a wide spectrum and scale of management options. Our understanding of the fiscal and economic impacts of these outcomes on this region will help to guide the decision-making. So let me describe the 3 outcomes that we assessed. The first is an outcome based on no infrastructure or policy interventions, and that's essentially the mapped projections that I showed. The other 2 outcomes are as follows. Number 2 is to maintain access to the island and through the intersection for the next 30 years. So essentially through the year 2050, maintain access to the island. So if it were feasible to maintain access to Plum Island along the turnpike and through the intersection for the next 30 years, what would be the economic and fiscal implications for Newbury and Newburyport? And we'll hear a little bit about that today. So the third outcome that we assessed is protecting all structures from flood erosion and damage. And within those structures, we're also talking about roadways. So if it were feasible to also protect all homes and businesses on the island from flooding, erosion, and flooded roads for the next 30 years, what would be the economic and fiscal implications for Newbury and Newburyport? So for purposes of the fiscal and economic analysis, we begin to categorize the impacts into two main tiers. The first tier is those roadways and buildings that are flooded or inaccessible due to daily high tide flooding, which are indicated in red. And tier 2 are those buildings and roadways that are at high risk of storm damage, as indicated by the 10-year flood limit and the identified erosion risk locations indicated in yellow. So these categories and colors will carry through the fiscal and economic analysis that you'll see presented shortly. And what you're looking at on this figure is the projected flood impact under outcome number 2, where access is maintained to the island and through the main intersection for the next 30 years. So you can see in this call out box of the main intersection that these homes are not red, but rather, I shouldn't say home, these buildings, some are commercial buildings, others residential, but these buildings are yellow rather than red because under this scenario, we've maintained access through these areas and kept them out of the floodplain. So this figure presents the third outcome we assessed, in which all structures and roadways on the island are protected from tidal flood impacts through the year 2050. You can see that roads and buildings that were red in the prior map are yellow in this map. In this scenario, through 2050, all roads are free from tidal flooding and all structures are protected in some way from daily tidal flooding. I want to reiterate here that this scenario is for analysis purposes and does not suggest that such outcomes are truly feasible or without significant challenges. So you can see on this map, as I stated, that all of these buildings are no longer in the red. They're either yellow or they are accessible. However, finally, with each of these two outcomes, flood protections were assumed to extend through the year 2050, but by 2070 or 50 years from now, the tidal flooding impacts on the island and the turnpike, as well as the potential erosion impacts, would be so extensive that these conditions would be assumed to overtake the adaptation efforts extended through 2050. As a result, as you see here, the majority of roads and all structures are in the red category due to direct flood impacts or flooded access. So let's consider the scale or order of magnitude of the cost to try to mitigate these flood and erosion impacts. To date, the communities of Newbury and Newburyport have scrambled to pull together funding to address these various emergency situations. As presented in our first meeting, these anecdotes of mitigation spending represent significant expenditures by private homeowners as well as local, state, and federal jurisdictions. In addition, other communities nearby and up and down the US coastline are considering similar sea level rise and flood risks and have begun to evaluate significant infrastructure upgrades to improve community resilience. While none of these is perfectly synonymous with the setting and conditions of Plum Island, these projects currently in the planning phase, shown on the bottom of the screen here, do provide us with a sense for the scale of infrastructure upgrades being considered nearby. You can see that costs for roadway elevation projects with varying complexities range from $2.5 million to $42.5 million per mile. The Plum Island Turnpike, for comparison, is approximately 2 miles from Rolfs Lane to the island. So let us return to the hypothetical future outcomes that we are assessing in our analysis. For purposes of illustration, let us consider that the cost for outcome number 2 to elevate the length of Plum Island Turnpike and the main intersection of entry to the island to prevent tidal flooding through 2050 might reasonably be in the realm of $60 million. Again, for purposes of illustration, let us consider that the cost to protect all structures and infrastructure from tidal flooding through 2050 might be $150 million or more. It is important for me to note again that we have not identified any specific methods for achieving this outcome. And in fact, the extreme methods that might be required, such as shoreline berms, hardening, seawalls, and/or elevating numerous public roadways, may in fact be infeasible or partially infeasible. However, I want to familiarize you with the scale of these potential costs, as they will come up again in the fiscal analysis you will hear about shortly. And with that, I'll turn it back to Elizabeth to introduce our project partners from Community 310.
Thanks so much, Ellie. So hopefully that gets your mind really in the game. That was a lot of information and where there's a lot more coming to you. Any just sort of burning, clarifying questions before we jump into the fiscal and economic analysis? Folks could raise their hand or type into the Q&A in the chat, and we will answer them before we move forward. Okay, great. And as I mentioned before, feel free to use that Q&A as Tom and Dan are presenting, and we'll try to answer questions as we go along and sort of jump in and pause for clarifications as needed. And then following their presentation, we'll have time where we'll start asking you some questions and really look for your guidance and feedback. So thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Hi, everyone. Thanks for this opportunity to present to you all tonight. My name is Tom Duretsky. I'm the Director of Research at Community 310. We're an economic development firm headquartered in Saratoga Springs, New York. I'm based here in Massachusetts in the Boston area, and I'm here also with my colleague Dan Stevens, who's a senior project manager at Community and an analytical lead on the project, who you'll hear from in just a second. Just a little bit about Community. We've been around for more than 20 years. We've completed over 1,000 projects in 40 states. We've worked on numerous economic and fiscal impact analyses that have been used by state and local governments and the private sector for strategic decision making. Our impact analyses have spanned a lot of topics, including tourism and visitation, tax credit programs, real estate development projects, renewable energy projects, and others. On the topic of coastal adaptation, we recently completed an analysis for the state of Louisiana, measuring the economic impact of coastal protection and restoration infrastructure investments on the state. So over the next 45 minutes or so, Dan and I will be walking you through an overview of the economic and fiscal analysis piece of the project. I'll start with an introduction of the purpose of the analysis. Then I'll turn it and cover a methodology overview. Then I'll turn it over to Dan to take us through 8 key takeaways. There are a lot of details and technical assumptions that went into this analysis. We only have time to hit the highlights here tonight, but for those interested, the full report will detail methodology and will be available next month. So when Dan is finished presenting, we'll hand it back over to Ellie, and she'll help us zoom back out and tell us how this kind of sets the stage for moving forward. And then we'll have an opportunity for a Q&A related to the fiscal analysis before we move on to wrap up. All right, so when we talk about fiscal and economic impact on Plum Island, there are a number of questions that we're setting out to answer here. So fiscal analysis has to do with Newberry and Newburyport's municipal budgets and answers questions like how much tax revenue does Plum Island generate? How does this compare to municipal spending on services related to Plum Island? And when you look at revenues and expenses, what's the annual net fiscal impact of Plum Island to each of the 2 municipalities? On the economic impact side, we're answering questions like how many jobs are supported in the 2 communities as a result of resident household spending and visitor spending associated with Plum Island. And those jobs can be either on or off Plum Island within the communities. And what is the multiplier effect of this economic activity? How does direct spending by households and visitors translate into indirect economic benefits in terms of additional jobs, earnings, and business sales in the 2 communities? So knowing the answers to these questions for Plum Island today and how they could change gives us some of the tools we need to plan for the future. So as a methodology overview, this analysis was conducted in 2 phases. There was the baseline analysis and then the future scenario modeling. So the baseline analysis looks at the current economic and fiscal impact of Plum Island on Newberry and Newburyport based on recent data for current conditions. So this involved demographic and economic data gathering, reviews of the municipal budgets, interviews with the municipal departments in both communities, and comparison of fiscal revenues and costs. So that's really answering, where's Plum Island today based on data from the recent past. And then phase 2 moves on to this future scenario modeling, where we're understanding how impacts could change in the future as climate conditions change and the different management outcomes for Plum Island could be pursued. So we know the sea level is rising, climate conditions will change, and there are different strategies that stakeholders will pursue to deal with these changes. What we're modeling are the impacts of the 3 different management outcomes that Ellie just walked us through that could potentially be pursued at 3 different time points in the future. So those different years of maps that Ellie just showed you. And as a reminder, the 3 scenarios were 1, no intervention, 2, maintain primary access via Plum Island in the main intersection, and 3, maintain access and protect everything on the island. So on the right side of this slide here, it just gives you a sense of kind of the breadth of model inputs that we looked at in our information gathering and that ultimately fed into our scenario modeling. So we're looking at everything from population and number of homes on the island, household spending, number of businesses, assessed value of the properties on the island, visitation to Plum Island and the spending that those visitors contribute, number of vehicles, building permits and construction activity, emergency services calls to police and fire, number of school children that are located on the island, and then of course, you know, all the tax revenues and municipal service costs associated with the island. So changes to these inputs change the fiscal equation for the 2 municipalities. And here's kind of the basic fiscal impact equation for Plum Island. On the left, we start with revenues, right? So those, in the case of Plum Island, are principally property tax revenues, but it also includes other municipal revenues, things like meals tax, lodging tax, and others. Then we subtract what we're calling the everyday expenses. So these are the typical day-to-day budget expenses associated with providing municipal services to Plum Island. Things like water and sewer services, police and fire services, public education to students, and so forth. These are kind of your typical budget items you'd see in any community. And then the third box is recovery and adaptation expenses, which up until now have been fairly small compared to our everyday expenses. So this includes things like storm-related costs to municipalities. That would include overtime costs to provide emergency services during and after storms, debris cleanup, road repair, damage to equipment, and other response costs dealing with storms that have occurred. And it also includes investments in adaptation infrastructure that will be needed in the future to keep Plum Island accessible and livable. So we know as these expenses grow over time, the net fiscal benefit equation becomes less positive as you have more and more expenses that you need to cover. The future scenario modeling will kind of help envision how this could change and by how much. Next slide, please. So in analyzing fiscal and economic impacts, it's also important to keep in mind that we're talking about community-wide impacts and not just impacts of Plum Island itself. Obviously, Plum Island is located within Newberry and Newburyport, and therefore services are provided by the municipalities and tax revenues are generated for the municipalities. Plum Island does not have its own independent budget. It's part of these municipalities. Also, the economy of the island is obviously very closely intertwined with the rest of the 2 communities. Plum Island households and visitors spend money both on and off the island, which supports jobs and businesses on Plum Island, but also in the mainland areas of both communities. So all that to say, what happens on Plum Island impacts Newberry, Newburyport as a whole. We also want to stress that the analysis is looking only at public municipal costs, costs that are borne by the 2 municipalities. The analysis is meant to quantify potential impacts from a local budget perspective and give municipalities the information they need for planning. It does not consider the significant costs that have been and will continue to be incurred by private property owners dealing with adaptation and recovery from storm and erosion impacts. These and many other factors are all pieces of the puzzle that need to be considered in future decision making. So we have 8 key takeaways that Dan will walk you through today. I'll quickly go through them now, and then Dan will address them one by one, incorporating the findings from the analysis. So key takeaway number 1, Plum Island currently provides a positive fiscal benefit to each community. Number 2, the fiscal benefit depends on accessibility and habitability of properties on the island. 3, the fiscal benefit of Plum Island is likely to decline beginning in the very near future due to sea level rise. 4, we can prolong the fiscal benefit by keeping Plum Island properties accessible if the costs don't outweigh the fiscal benefits. Takeaway number 5, in addition to maintaining access, extreme measures could keep more properties accessible and habitable, but high costs would likely outweigh the fiscal benefit. 6, time is of the essence. Faster action makes more fiscal sense. Number 7, regardless of action taken, the fiscal benefit of Plum Island is going to decrease over time because of sea level rise. And takeaway number 8, the fiscal benefits and costs are just one piece of the puzzle. So now I'll turn it over to Dan, and he will walk us all through these takeaways in detail.
All right, thank you, Tom. Good evening, everybody. Just add my thanks for joining us tonight. As Tom mentioned, I'm going to take us through these 8 takeaways and go over a little bit about how we got to each. So starting with our first key takeaway here, Plum Island currently provides a positive fiscal benefit to each community. So let's dig into that. Why is Plum Island providing this positive impact today? And keep in mind, right now we're talking about present day, and we'll talk a little bit about the future shortly. But of course, a positive fiscal impact means that those annual revenues to the municipalities from Plum Island are exceeding the annual cost. And the most significant component on the revenue side of things is the property tax being generated by properties on Plum Island. And you see here, when you look at the property tax generated from those properties, it's about 3.9 million annually to the town of Newbury and 3.8 million to the city of Newburyport. So very similar property tax revenue figures. But of course, with the town of Newbury, that makes up a much larger piece of the pie in terms of the community's overall property tax revenue. A smaller piece of the pie in Newburyport, but still a significant piece of the revenues, for each community every year. So those property tax revenues really make up the bulk of the annual revenues from Plum Island. As Tom mentioned, there are some other kind of more miscellaneous ones. But let's talk a little bit about some of those everyday municipal costs that are factored into this equation. And so again, by these everyday costs, we're essentially talking about those typical budget expenses as if Plum Island was, a neighborhood anywhere else in the community. And so when we're looking just at those costs, you can see that these annual costs, account for about 1.17 million for Newbury on an annual basis, and just a little bit higher, 1.27 million for Newburyport every year. So again, we're not considering those, that orange box that Tom showed, where we're talking about the recovery and adaptation just yet, but with these everyday costs, this is roughly what's attributable to Plum Island. So let's revisit this equation. When we look at the annual revenues and costs for the municipalities associated with Plum Island, we find that there is this net benefit after we account for those everyday expenses, the red box in our equation there. We find that that's roughly about $3 million each year for each community, just slightly higher in the town of Newbury. Again, I'm going to reiterate this throughout, when we talk about this benefit, we're not yet factoring in this orange box, those kind of more special costs associated with storm recovery and adaptation expenses related to sea level rise. So this is very much kind of a stepping stone in our analysis. Just something to keep in mind as we walk through this year. Another important point to make here, when we talk about this fiscal benefit, all right, this $3 million roughly for each community, it wouldn't be fair to necessarily call that a surplus, right? These aren't funds that are going into a savings account or cash in a vault somewhere to be saved for a rainy day, right? These are funds that each community collects every year, and it becomes part of the normal budgeting process, and it's incorporated into those typical municipal operating expenses used for paving roads and maintaining parks and so on. So again, another important thing to keep in mind while we're talking about this fiscal benefit. So our second key takeaway here, the fiscal benefit depends on the accessibility and habitability of properties on the island. So intuitively, that makes sense, right? In order for the properties on Plum Island to have value and to generate revenue, particularly property tax revenue, you have to be able to access those properties, and they have to be in a relatively good state of repair, and so not being constantly flooded, and so on. So let's go back here to these property impacts, these future property impacts that Ellie had introduced. Into the future properties in our analysis are falling into one of three buckets here. And the future fiscal impact very much depends on the number of properties falling into each of these buckets. And we're going to dig into that further tonight. But just to reiterate here, we have our green, that's our minimal impact properties. The yellow category are those properties, again, that are at high risk of storm or erosion damage. And then in the red here are those properties that are flooded or inaccessible on a daily basis. So here's an overview of the number of properties that fall into those three categories in each of the timeframes that we've looked at as part of this analysis, and for each of those three scenarios. So you'll recall our first scenario, which is our top graph on this slide, is no intervention. So this is essentially the scenario where nature is running its course. And what does that look like? Scenario 2, maintaining primary access. So things like elevating Plum Island Turnpike, maintaining that primary access so the island is accessible. And then scenario 3, where we're not only maintaining access, but we're going to more extreme measures to protect everything. So we are going to talk a little bit more in detail about each of these three scenarios, but when you see these graphs kind of lined up like this, you can kind of get a good sense of how these impacts compare. With scenario 1, you see that by 2050, and as Ellie had mentioned, by 2050, all of the properties on the island, are essentially flooded or inaccessible daily. In scenario 2, you look at 2050 and you see a much smaller proportion of properties are now falling into that red category because we've maintained that access. Of course, you see in 2070, again, as Ellie mentioned, all of the properties in all of these scenarios are expected to fall into that category because we know the effects of sea level rise in 2070 are going to be that extreme that we don't expect measures to be able to prevent those types of impacts from happening.
Dan,
so
before we jump forward, could I just ask if there were, everybody, you should know there's some really interesting questions coming in via the Q&A that we're responding to in writing. Feel free to look at those and see the questions and answers. And I just wanted to pause for a minute to see if anybody has any clarifying questions of what we've covered so far. I know we have miles to go before we sleep, but just wanted to offer Feel free to press the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen if you want to chime in real quick. Okay, carry on, Dan. Thanks. Sorry for the
All
interruption.
right, no problem. Thanks, Elizabeth. Yeah, please continue to enter those questions. I see them popping up on the side of my screen here. Our third key takeaway here, the fiscal benefit of Plum Island is likely going to decline beginning in the very near future due to sea level rise. So why is this the case? Let's take a closer look at our scenario 1 here. Again, this is where no intervention is being made. So this is what the future looks like if we essentially, again, let nature run its course as part of this scenario. So in 2030, again, just 9 years from now, we're already seeing roughly 11 properties falling into that red category. You can probably barely see that on the graph. So, relatively few, but, we are already expecting, 11 properties to fall into that category. And then by 2050, as you recall in this scenario, all the properties on Plum Island are falling into our red category in 2050 of being flooded or inaccessible on a daily basis. And so that continues on 2050 and beyond. So all 1,200 plus properties in this case. So now that we know what the property impacts look like, what does that mean for that fiscal benefit that we discussed earlier? So if you recall, each community is experiencing currently a fiscal benefit of about $3 million annually. So together, the present day fiscal benefit, again combined, is about $6 million. And so just a note here, we're going to be talking about the two communities combined, just kind of for the sake of simplicity in this presentation. But when you have a chance to read the full report, you'll see that everything is broken out for each individual municipality. So in scenario 1, where no intervention is taken, nature runs its course, and the fiscal benefit declines. By 2030, it declines slightly, and then you see by 2050 that benefit disappears. Again, as all of those properties move into that red column where they're flooded or inaccessible on a daily basis. So I want to stop and make an important note again here. You'll remember that our fiscal benefit, the green line, is not accounting for those storm costs. So, that orange box that we showed previously, those more kind of special costs versus the everyday costs. So in reality, we know that the fiscal benefit is actually a bit lower. And as we've discussed earlier and Ellie covered, we don't have a full or comprehensive accounting for what those costs are. But from the costs that we do know, and we've gone through, as Tom went through, a pretty significant information collection gathering process. And so, we do know what some of those costs are. And from that, we know that, those costs exist, but they're not significant enough. So, that we would be saying that the $6 million benefit is wiped out by those costs. In fact, in reality, it's probably not anything really approaching 6 million, on an average annual basis. But again, we don't know exactly where. That's one of the limitations that we're faced with as part of this study. So it is something important to just kind of keep in the back of your minds as we go ahead. And we'll be talking a little bit more about how that factors in a little bit here. All right, so let's keep moving to key takeaway number 4. We can prolong the fiscal benefit by keeping Plum Island properties accessible, such as elevating Plum Island Turnpike, if the costs don't outweigh the fiscal benefits. So now we're focusing on scenario 2, which is, again, the scenario where primary access is maintained to Plum Island. And you can see here a pretty substantial difference compared to scenario 1, where no intervention is being made. In 2050, 970 fewer properties are falling into that red category, the flooded or inaccessible daily. Again, though, in 2070, all properties are still moving into that red column. But the path to get there looks better in terms of more properties remaining accessible, habitable, functional, and so on. So what does that mean, again, for our fiscal benefit? As you might expect, the fiscal benefit is looking better than it did for scenario 1, where no intervention was taken, and that green line kind of just plummeted down to 0 in 2050. So, generally these, the way to read these charts, just as a rule of thumb, the higher that green line is, the more positive, the lower, closer down to that red negative territory, and so on. So, you can see, 2050 to 2070, we still have a positive benefit being generated because we've maintained now that primary access. Again, 2070, we still dropped to 0, but the path to get to 2070 is a little bit better, than it was with our scenario 1. So while we know the benefit looks better, right, there's still a catch. There's a cost to get to scenario 2, needed to make scenario 2 happen. So as Ellie mentioned, we don't know exactly what that cost will be, but we know what's within the realm of possibility from the examples that we've seen around the country. Again, going back to some of those figures that Ellie shared earlier. So as an illustrative example here, we've modeled what a 60 million investment would mean in terms of its fiscal implications. So again, we're not saying this is the precise cost, but certainly within the realm of possibility. So if we model this out, and this could play out in different ways. So again, this is just kind of an illustrative example, and we've built in some assumptions here. But if we were to model this out, this type of investment would generate an annual financing cost of about $3 million. So, think in terms of a loan or a bond, you're not paying for it all at once, but if you were to finance this over a number of years, as is fairly typical, you have to account for roughly that $3 million cost every year. So let's take a look at what that means. So again, we'll go back to our benefit line here. And this is what that line now looks like when that cost is factored in. So I know this looks complicated probably at first glance, but let's walk through this a little bit. So in 2030, where that line kind of first jogs down towards the, the more negative territory. In this example, we're saying that's when that financing cost kicks in. So in 2030, this hypothetical project is completed, financing costs kick in. And so that's why that line is dropping down there. In this case, we're looking at a 30-year financing period. So the municipalities would be making those payments to cover that initial $60 million expenditure from those 30 years from 2030 to 2060. And because you have to factor in finance costs in this example, so essentially your interest payments, the actual cost in this case ends up being closer to 94 million over that long term. So, what does this mean? That 94 million, is a big number, but it's not enough to wipe out the total positive benefit here in this case. But it does wipe out, a pretty significant chunk of that benefit. About 62% of the benefit is, essentially eaten up by these financing costs, and so that's 60 million plus, your finance costs on top of that. So you can start to see here, and again, this is illustrative, and there's different ways that this type of investment could play out, but you can start to see how the benefit cost equation will come into play. So at a certain point with a large enough expense, the fiscal equation is going to turn negative. But for now, with this 60 million example, we're still staying in that positive territory over the long run through 2070. We're going to move on to our next key takeaway here. In addition to maintaining access, extreme measures could prevent more properties from being flooded or inaccessible daily. But high costs would likely outweigh the fiscal benefit. So let's go ahead and dig into that one a little bit more. And so when we say extreme measures, we really are talking about pretty extreme infrastructure type of investments. If we're talking about protecting all properties on Plum Island. So, being extreme to the point where, potentially the scenario might not be something realistic, but it's important still to consider, because it does illustrate the maximum fiscal benefit that's possible. If these were extreme measures were to be taken, what is kind of the maximum benefit that you could preserve from Plum Island? So by protecting everything on Plum Island, there are now no longer any properties falling into that red category in 2050, right? There's been some major infrastructure investment, which is now protecting properties. You still see some a little bit higher risk, but none are falling into the red category, again, until we get to 2070, where again, it's kind of this inevitable point that we're going to get to. So in 2050, we're protecting an additional 244 properties from being flooded and being inaccessible daily, compared to scenario 2, which again is just our scenario where we're just maintaining the primary access. So to go from maintaining primary access to potentially a whole range of very extreme infrastructure investments, improvements to protect everything on Plum Island, that protects an additional 244 properties. So let's take a look at what that means for our fiscal benefit here. So if you recall, our scenario 1 line was the one that dropped down to into 0 in 2050. So pretty quickly, our benefit line here looks better than scenario 2, and we're gonna show all of them compared to one another in just a couple minutes here. But you can see that benefit doesn't decline much in, through 2050, and then only really starts to drop after 2050 as we start to approach 2070. But we know that maintaining primary access and then also protecting everything is going to be expensive. We don't know exactly what that cost will be, but again, from the examples that we've taken a look at, we know what might be within the realm of possibility. And so in this case, we've modeled what that 150 million investment would mean. So again, this 150 million is used in this as kind of our hypothetical illustrative cost. We know it's within the realm of possibility. And the assumption here is if that investment is made, then we achieve this result where access to Plum Island is maintained And we've protected properties on Plum Island from sea level rise, at least up until 2070. So just one note here, in this example, we're assuming the municipalities would be responsible for this cost, but you can imagine that state and federal money would potentially come into play here. And so, there's all kinds of funding scenarios that we can be, consider, but just kind of for the purposes of our analysis and illustration this evening, we're taking a look at, let's just assume that the municipalities are on the hook for this potential cost. And of course, there's no guarantee that state or federal money is available down the line either. So let's go back quickly to where our benefit line starts with our scenario 3, the maintain access and protect and preserve everything. When we factor in this $150 million cost, this is what happens with that line. And you can see how that line immediately dips into that red negative territory, which is indicating that the municipalities would be experiencing an annual negative fiscal impact beginning right away because of those financing costs start immediately outweighing that benefit. So, how does this balance out in the long term? You can see that there are areas, in the positive territory on this graph. So how does that balance out with the areas that are, essentially negative? And when we start to do the math, that tells us that an investment cost of 150 million or greater, that's essentially the point at which the long-term fiscal impact turns negative. So again, we're factoring in financing costs here. So 150 million investment cost plus those interest payments. I'm not going to quiz anybody on these numbers. I know this starts to get complicated pretty quick, but I think the important thing is kind of these take-home messages, and all of these numbers, of course, will be available in the technical report in a couple weeks. So with that being said, let's make this more complicated. With our scenario 3 here, you notice with that orange line, that drops into the red territory right away. So you can see here with this yellow line that an investment made of 115 million or greater, that's the point that immediately gets you to that 0 mark and into negative territory. So, if you're making an investment of more than 115 million in 2030, this would imply that you have an immediate annual negative impact because those finance payments to cover that cost for that investment are now exceeding the benefit that we're getting from Plum Island. So, that's something, again, important to consider, with anything greater than 115 million in this case. The communities are faced with 30 years of essentially, being in the red, where this is a kind of a net negative fiscal impact. So to summarize what our analysis of scenario 3 is telling us, again, where we're maintaining access to Plum Island and protecting everything, any investment of approximately 150 million or greater in 2030 would result in an overall long-term negative fiscal impact. But an investment of 115 million only or more again, that gets us into kind of the red territory immediately in terms of our annual fiscal impact. So the first number there, we're talking about kind of big picture long-term from today through 2070. And the second number here, the 115 million, that gets us to kind of an immediate annual negative fiscal impact. So some important things to keep in mind as part of this, this is hypothetical and, without consideration of whether it would even be realistic for the municipalities to, finance such a high cost. In reality, other sources of funds would probably need to come into play here. We've also shown this happening in 1 year. In reality, these types of things are more complicated with different projects happening on different time frames and having different impacts as they're implemented. So, this is certainly a simplification, but again, it's kind of providing that helpful framework for thinking about these benefits and costs. With our next takeaway, time is of the essence. Faster action makes more fiscal sense. So we haven't talked a whole lot about the timing of these things, but the timing ends up being very significant. So here we're going to go back and revisit our second scenario. So our second scenario is where we're just maintaining access, primary access to Plum Island. So this is what our benefit curve looked like in this case. We showed you that with a $60 million investment beginning in 2030, the curve, it starts to shift down, at least for those 30 years. And it looks like this. But now we need to start thinking about how the timing matters. So in this case, we're now shifting that orange line from 2030, and we're now shifting that forward or into the future by 20 years. So rather than this investment occurring in 2030, what happens if this investment is delayed and it's not made until 2050? As a result of moving this investment by 20 years, that financing cost isn't occurring until further down the line. But now that cost is being incurred past 2070 when we know the fiscal benefit has already gone to zero. Because of this, the municipalities would be fiscally worse off by about $50 million compared to if that investment was made in 2030. So you can see just the trade-off, the fiscal impact that you'd be trading off by going from 2030 to 2050. So again, this is just an illustrative example, but you can start to see how the timing of these types of investments become very critical. So again, just to summarize here quickly, simply put, taking action sooner preserves the greatest fiscal benefit. But again, keeping in mind that the cost is not outweighing the fiscal benefit. So our key takeaway number 7 out of 8. Regardless of action taken, the fiscal benefit of Plum Island is going to decrease over time due to sea level rise. So I know this one kind of sounds like a downer, but it's a really critical point that we have to make, that really no matter what, the fiscal benefit is going to decline due to sea level rise. And sometime around 2070, that fiscal benefit is going to essentially disappear. But you see the chart here, the graph here, that compares the fiscal benefit of 3 scenarios that we've talked about. You can see, here that the path to 270 to 2070 can look quite different, depending on the type of action that is taken. So our scenario 1, the blue line here is, the fiscal benefit is dropping to 0 quickly. This is, no intervention is taken. Nature is running its course. Whereas with scenario 2, the kind of the neon pink color on the graph here, the fiscal benefit looks quite a bit better, but also drops to 0 in 2070. And then lastly, our scenario 3, not only are we maintaining access, but we're now doing all of these extreme measures to protect everything. It looks the best in terms of, the benefit side of the equation, but, again, we're not factoring in the costs, at least in this piece. But again, dropping to 0 in 2070. So as part of our work and our analysis, we've considered those fiscal implications of going from one scenario to another. And so, this is kind of another way of looking at the graph we just showed. By going from scenario 1 to scenario 2, by investing in a project that maintains primary access to Plum Island, the fiscal benefit is 76% better compared to just our scenario 1. Now going from scenario 2 to scenario 3, where we're maintaining access and protecting everything, it's still an improvement, it's still an incremental benefit, but you see that that incremental benefit is considerably smaller, improving 11% over scenario 2. So, the takeaway here is that, really there's a big fiscal benefit just from preserving access to Plum Island, and a much smaller incremental benefit from going from scenario 2 and taking that extra step to protect everything, which we know is going to have very major costs associated with it. So our last takeaway that we wanted to cover with you, the fiscal benefits and costs are just one piece of the puzzle. We've talked mostly tonight about public costs and benefits to each municipality, and that is certainly the focus of our effort. But that is not the only thing that's going to factor into future decisions made around Plum Island. So we know that we have our, we're narrowed in our focus purposefully, but we also know that, this fits into kind of a broader context and other things that need to be considered. One of those other pieces of the puzzle are the economic benefits. And so our work has included looking at the current and future economic benefits of Plum Island to each community. So I'm going to cover these, and then I'm going to turn things over to Ellie, who's going to talk a little bit about some of those other pieces of the puzzle. But when we're talking about the economic impacts, you can see here that those benefits are pretty significant. About 61 jobs, or a little bit more than 1 out of 10 jobs in Newberry exist because of Plum Island. Again, we're not saying that these are jobs on Plum Island, but they exist in the community because of Plum Island. People coming to Plum Island, going to the beach, spending money at local businesses, people living on the island who are shopping, at stores and businesses throughout the both community, are some of the impacts, are where some of these impacts are coming from. And, when you look at Newberry Port, where you have more businesses, more jobs to start with, that's a pretty significant job figure. 654 jobs generated in the city of Newberry Port because of Plum Island. Only 4% of the total employment, but certainly 654 jobs is a pretty significant number. And so these economic impacts are going to continue to grow gradually as long as accessibility to Plum Island is maintained, right? Which of course makes sense. If people can continue to live on the island, they'll continue to shop at local businesses. If visitors can go down to Parker River, they'll be coming through the community, eating at restaurants, shopping, and so on. But as we've discussed, there's still a cost to keep in mind, particularly for maintaining access past 2050. So, in addition to the fiscal benefit from maintaining that access, the substantial number of jobs that are preserved in both communities are a piece of that return on investment to also keep in mind. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Ellie to talk a little bit about some of the other pieces of the puzzle. I'm sure we'll come back and talk a little bit more and answer some questions, but Ellie, why don't I hand things off to you?
Great, thanks, Dan. So we've heard about the fiscal and economic implications of sea level rise on Plum Island, and we've examined the potential fiscal implications of significant investments in adaptation or risk reduction measures. But what about all the other considerations that come into play when planning for the future? We did not want to portray the illusion that fiscal and economic costs to the municipalities are the only variables that matter. In fact, just the opposite. And we recognize that there's a wide array of other information and considerations that should enter into the decision process. So listed here are just some of them, and these are things that are other considerations because of the uniqueness of Plum Island as part of both communities and as part of the region and the Northeast. So natural goods and services, also known in some realms as ecosystem services, provided by Plum Island to the rest of the communities. There's other environmental and ecological considerations, habitat, birding, tourism that's associated with that. There's the physical and engineering feasibility of different adaptation infrastructure. I know some of the questions have been coming in asking about some of the costs, et cetera, of adaptation infrastructure, and we have not identified exactly what that is. These are other considerations that need to be brought into the discussion. There's also private property owner interests on the island. What we've been talking about today is really the municipal, fiscal, and economic analysis, but there's also obviously private property interests. Health and safety issues on the island, emergency service provisions, and just the community character that Plum Island brings to the region. So these are all other things, and I'm hopeful and anticipate that others have other thoughts on these considerations of things that should be brought into the decision-making process. Next slide, please. So I just want to review a few of the highlights from the fiscal and economic analysis, and then I will turn it over to Elizabeth to work us through with some question and discussion. So just a few of the key things that this study tells us. I just want to summarize. So number one, as a result of sea level rise and the increasing intensity and frequency of large storm events as a result of climate change, as Dan said, we can expect more and more impacts to structures and municipal infrastructure on the island over time, and this will result in a decline in the fiscal benefit of Plum Island each year into the future. So this is true even for the scenarios where tidal flooding impacts are mitigated through 2050. Eventually, the sea level rise and the increasing intensity and frequency of storm events will cause this fiscal benefit to decline. As we also heard, investments can prolong that benefit, but only to a point. There's a balance between the benefit provided and the size of the investments. So we selected 60 million and 150 million as general estimates for how much these investments may cost, just to illustrate this point. And we also learned that that investment can make fiscal sense depending on a few key elements. So one is the magnitude of the cost, as I just mentioned. Another is the timing of the investment. We saw the difference in the outcomes if the timing is earlier rather than later. And then that also plays into how long the accessibility or the habitability of Plum Island and the properties is preserved, and also how many properties can be maintained into the future. Next slide, please. And then finally, this is an important one, as I mentioned, but time is of the essence here. So it's important to be having these conversations now. We're very pleased with the number of participants that have come out for both of our meetings, and we're excited to hear your comments. And we hope that this generates continued conversations, input, and planning for this decision making. And then if investments are going to be made, it makes more sense to take action as early as possible. We don't know exactly what that action will be, but we need to start thinking about that as soon as possible. It takes time to get these actions planned, designed, permitted, and then constructed, or policies approved, et cetera. So time is of the essence for this. And then I just wanted to say thank you to Tom and Dan for your presentation, and thank you all for listening and asking the important questions that we've already seen coming in. We hope that you have saved some energy for a bit of discussion. So I'm going to turn it back over to Elizabeth to facilitate the remainder of the discussion session. So, thank you.
Thanks so much, Ellie. So thank you all so much for your patience and your engagement and asking really good questions as we go along. You've heard a lot of information and analysis. Hopefully you've been able to kind of digest as we go. And now we really need your help to make this information meaningful and help guide the communities forward and clarify the next steps. So let me just say, everything that we're hearing tonight, all the sort of useful information questions you ask, and then the sort of advice and ideas that you're throwing out there, we're going to capture all of that and incorporate it into the report that we're writing. We're trying to answer everything that we can right now tonight. Some questions that we can't, and even those that we do, we're going to try to sort of put those answers into that final report that we'll draft and make publicly available. And let me also say, if there's anything you don't get to ask tonight or any input you don't get to give tonight, there's also a survey available on the project website where you can add more questions and feedback. And again, we'll use that to sort of inform the framing and the content of the report, and encourage you to send your friends to give input via that survey as well. So with that said, let me just see if there's any sort of burning clarifying questions about the content that we have just learned about together before we go into kind of discussion and consideration of options. I know, again, the really rich and good questions that have been asked in writing all along with those. Anybody want to ask a question verbally? Just at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you can press raise hand and I'll unmute you if so. Okay, I'm not seeing any now, but feel free to chime in. Let me just share with you some discussion prompts. Dan, if you could show those questions that we want to ask participants, that would be great. So we're going to walk through these kind of one by one together. But let me just sort of tell you what we want to hear from you. One is just sort of, how is this landing for you? If you walk around the block and run into a neighbor or a friend, what's the sort of most important insight from tonight you would share? What do you think that the communities need to be thinking about from what we've learned here together? And then sort of looking towards the future, given what we're understanding about sea level rise that we've heard from Ellie and the sort of resulting fiscal projections that Tom and Dan shared, how should the experience of Plum Island evolve in the coming decades? What do we need to reimagine? What should stay the same? Those kinds of thinking. And then we go to sort of planning questions, like what other kinds of information do we need to gather? You all have started to answer this by asking lots of good questions about the sort of costs and benefits and who can pay and what other sources of revenue could be brought forward. But what other information do we need to make good planning decisions in the future? Because we know this is just sort of one piece of the pie, as Dan mentioned. And then what are the sort of near-term steps that you think we should be taking? What would you like to see the communities undertake in the next couple of years? And those might be studies and planning questions, or those might be kind of actions that we know when you think about sort of capital improvements and investments, those take a number of years to kind of tee up and begin to actually implement. So that's where we want to go with you all. there's a chance for you to answer all of these verbally, and then we're also going to use that poll everywhere that we introduced everybody with at the beginning. So Maggie's going to put a poll everywhere link in the chat again. It'll open into your browser. And the way that this works, so we will be sort of going through these one by one. You will enter in sort of some of your answers, and then you'll also be seeing what everybody else is putting in. And you can upvote other people's contributions, and that will help sort of really insightful comments or things that we need to be especially aware of kind of rise to the top. So we're going to ask you to open up that link, and we'll just give you a couple of minutes to answer that first question there, and keep that open so that you can see the responses from your fellow participants as well. And while folks are doing that, if there's anybody who wants to chime in verbally, again, I know it's not nearly as fun or easy as doing with an in-person meeting, but we'd love to hear from you all. And just one other facet of this tool that we're using, Poll Everywhere, you can choose to sort it by new, which is how it is by default, so that it just becomes sort of a running thread of all of the comments that are coming in, or you can press top, and that will make the questions that have been upvoted the most rise to the top. Or the comments, that is. So just a few comments that are coming in. We need to invest into preserving current structures on the island before it's too late. Tell your neighbors and friends that they need to go look at these recordings to become educated. That's great. I hope that many people will go to the website and watch these after the fact. Right, the current 6 million isn't going into a rainy day fund, it's part of your current budget. So as that revenue depletes over time, that introduces, where does that shortfall get made up? That's a good question. And really big investments, like the sort of go big option, might not actually make sense. That one that sort of is invest everything and sort of harden everything to the hilt. Just give folks another minute or two to enter responses here, and then we'll move forward.
Elizabeth, there's a hand.
Oh, great. Judith, let me allow you to talk. And Judith, you'll have to unmute yourself also.
Hi, thank you so much for this. It seems to me that the costs of losing a barrier island, or most of it, are enormous and need to be taken into account. Losing the Great Salt Marsh, or part of it, is a huge ecological disaster. Not having storm protection to the mainland would seem to be another huge cost to the community, to say nothing of the fact that we on Plum Island have been subsidizing the mainland for the last 40 years that I know of, and receive almost no benefits other than schools. I mean, there are huge costs here that will be inflicted on people if we don't do something. Am I wrong? Am I thinking about this wrong?
I think you're raising really good questions, and this question of sort of what, one way of talking about it is sort of ecosystem services, or what kind of ecological benefits is the island providing to the mainland, both in terms of protection and others. That's something that we haven't quantified yet. Quantifying it is a hard thing to do, but doesn't mean we shouldn't try to figure out what the sort of impacts there are. I don't know if anybody else from the team wants to chime in on that. Thanks for that comment, Judith. And let me just return to all of the really good responses that you all have been making in our poll everywhere so far. Yeah, the importance of Newbury and Newburyport continuing to work together, I think that can't be underscored enough. And someone says, none of these plans save the island by 2070, so we need to do even more to stop climate change in the first place. I think that's an important point as well. So thanks so much for all of these. Let's move to the next question, thinking about sort of how you imagine Plum Island changing and evolving in the future, given this analysis. So same deal, if you can enter in your responses, everybody feel free to upvote other entries that you think are really thoughtful, and raise your hand if you'd like to chime in verbally. We'll give folks a minute or two to do that. So you should be able to just stay in that same link. And if you close it, you can click it again from the chat. Anybody want to chime in verbally on sort of, what does this make you think? Do you have sort of creative out of the box ideas about the future of Plum Island? Are there sort of key sort of, you know, essential aspects of the island that you hope we can carry forward? Someone saying, I think we should have a planned retreat and turn the island over to being a larger refuge. There's an idea. Aim for what can be afforded by 2050, but start making alternative plans such as relocation. Yeah, that there's more at stake than just for the two municipalities, so that sort of regional coordination and looping in the state and the federal government important also. Yep, longer periods of inaccessibility will be the norm for sure. Points about adding new buildings on the island sort of further commits us to a future, to a certain future on the island, right? And so what does that mean for future development? This is great. Thank you all so much for these thoughtful comments. Let me go to Charlotte first, who wants to chime in verbally. Charlotte, just unmute yourself, and then I think I saw somebody else, but then their hand was lowered. Oh, there's Stephen. I'll with Stephen after.
I was having trouble getting into the other way of answering. I just wanted to absolutely agree with the person who said we should reimagine Plum Island as just an extension of the nature retreat, that already exists in part of the island. The former, I think, head of storm surge, Mr. Sargent, would have said that barrier islands are not truly islands. They're just shifting bits of sand that should never really be developed. I don't mean to offend everyone out there. I lived in Newburyport for 10 wonderful years, and made sure when I bought a property in 2008 that it was 35 feet above sea level. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Charlotte. Thanks so much for that point. Stephen, go ahead. I've just allowed you to talk. You just have to unmute.
Hi, I'm reminded, being a man of a certain age, of the old George Hall commercial where the punchline was that it's not nice to mess with Mother Nature. And ultimately, I think that men against the sea, or people against the sea, is a losing cause. And we need to recognize that sea level is going to rise and what that means. In fact, the current position of the barrier island owes to the reality of sea level rise as it's migrated towards what is now the coast. And I think we need to consider options that consider, moving back from the coast and perhaps allowing us, I think Charlotte and other people may have suggested, allowing nature to take its course and perhaps being a nature preserve out here rather than something that involves human habitation. And that raises the possibility of a buyout where we spend the money buying out properties as they become available rather than spending money against the endless procession of sea level rise. And with that, I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Thanks for that comment. And yeah, I think all kinds of options need to be considered. Some folks are in our poll everywhere are naming some sort of process options that, like, we need to be talking to each other about this going forward, that there's need for sort of small group discussions or forming sort of an ongoing task force. So thanks for raising that as a point. There's lots of sort of thoughts about, knowing that we have kind of not unlimited resources here. Where is the most impactful way to put our dollars right now? Another theme that I'm sort of seeing rise here. Let's go to the next question with sort of planning considerations and near-term actions that folks foresee. So what else do you think the communities will need to know to make good decisions? What needs to be studied, evaluated, or discussed? You all have started to raise these in the Q&A, questions about, well, how much does it really cost to raise the turnpike? Who could pay for that? What are the sort of ecosystem consequences of different hardening actions we could take? Who else cares about this? Who else could be compelled to pay for it? Lots like that. We'd love to hear some more from you on that. And again, feel free to raise hand if you want to chime in verbally. Oh, and Kincaid is raising a point. Yes, when you talk, if you could introduce yourself, that would be great. My oversight not to ask people to do that. Thank you. We need to engage more of the 1,200 property owners on the island. Yes, right. We have committed folks who show up to virtual public meetings here, which is some of you. We hope that you will share this recording and sort of help start the conversation much more broadly, but we need for sure to engage more of residents on the island and more of the communities broadly. Question about what's the impact and probability of a direct hit superstorm? Some of those sort of like really scary scenarios like we've seen elsewhere on the coast. Yep. The fiscal implications of ecological services provided by the island and how they may influence the fiscal decisions. Yep. And we know that that's like a bear of an analytical task, but a really important one. Yeah, and some feasibility studies that people are raising, like what does it actually look like to raise the turnpike? What does it really look like? We have only done the sort of most cursory level planning analysis of these options so far. So we need to sort of start to answer the other side of the question, which is like, if we actually want to spend money on that, what does it look like and how much does it really cost? Any of our participants want to comment, either reflecting on the comments your fellow participants are making or share any other thoughts? The point here, the current model does not give weight to the other considerations. The issues at stake involve more than just dollars. Right, this analysis, while it was quite a big analytical undertaking, it doesn't have all of the sort of ingredients here. It doesn't include these ecosystem services. It doesn't include some of the sort of intrinsic values of the island or the significance that it plays for both communities. It is necessarily limited.
Elizabeth, I just wanted to comment. One of the comments that came up is that the potential that sea level rise will not be as significant as is being described. And I think there was a question that came in on that note as well. And I do want to acknowledge that, yes, that's true. There is certainly a chance that things will not be as bad as we're presenting, and or the timeline will be very different from what we're presenting. We're using best available projections for this analysis, and it can be adjusted in the future, and it would be great if things don't progress at the rate that we've shown. So we acknowledge that definitely, that things could happen at a different time frame than we're presenting here. But we're presenting the best info that we can.
I see a hand from Stephen. I just want to see if there's anybody who hasn't yet had a chance to chime in. But Stephen, you should be able to talk. Go ahead, just unmute yourself.
Hi, and thanks again. And I don't mean to be the bull in the china closet, though perhaps I am. I remember the perfect storm and how the Newburyport waterfront suffered a lot of flooding. And I'm thinking when we talk about sea level rise, it goes well beyond Plum Island. And I realize we're focusing on Plum Island, but I just look at what can happen along Water Street and Merrimack Street, perhaps, with a sea level rise. And we need to take that into consideration when we do the big picture. It's going to happen, and particularly if it happens with regard to storm surge, it's perhaps going to far exceed some of the projections we're making. And the other context which I'll offer up is that I've heard some people talking about development, particularly on the waterfront, whether it be in Newburyport or on Plum Island. And I note that it was only a couple months ago that Newbury just allowed a restaurant to be constructed in what is arguably going to be a flood zone with sea level rise, regardless of the other considerations we're talking about. So that I tend to think that the town planners, the city planners need to do as much as they're talking about, because when confronted with reality of sea level rise, they tend to defer to development. And I think that's a long-term problem for all of us. Thank you. I'm done.
Thank you, Stephen. And let me just call out a couple more comments that came in writing, that there are sort of other access possibilities besides raising the turnpike to consider. And that we need to think more about what the island itself looks like, even if you raise the turnpike to preserve access. What happens if a lot of what you're accessing on the other end is flooded regularly, and what's the impact of sort of regular seawater inundation, stuff like that. Like what are sort of financing options for buyouts, and what to do about the sort of broken FEMA process. Looking at this is sort of to the point that Stephen raised, what are the current building and expansion and growth trends on the island? And so what is that like, we need to sort of project into the future what that means and what sort of policy levers there are available there as well. So this is just the start of a really complicated and rich and important conversation. I think we're kind of scratching the surface here. I want to turn in a minute to our planning directors from both municipalities to just kind of reflect where the communities go from here, how to keep this conversation going, and then tell you a little bit about our next steps. And in the meantime, feel free to keep putting in comments in the Q&A and in our poll everywhere here. Let me go to Martha first, please.
Well, I've been jotting a lot of things down as we've talked about it, and I think I think Camoin really covered a lot of the takeaways. But I think for me, sort of looking at this in terms of potential for daily flooding, I think so much of our focus has been on storm damage and storm surge, erosion, and things like that. But really looking at the future in terms of the daily flooding as well as these other impacts, and then thinking about the combination of both of them. It's a very powerful picture. No matter what time frame it actually turns out to be happening in. And I think the critical thing that was emphasized several times is really time is of the essence. I think we really need to start thinking and talking about these things. I mean, this is the beginning of the conversation, but to really identify the critical things that need to be looked at and start planning for them now, because the sooner we do that, the greater the benefit will be. And I think also kind of thinking outside the box, creativity. I went to a Boston Society of Architects presentation. I think it was their sustainability committee, where somebody was actually proposing a dike going from Hull, I think, up to Swampscott, 8 miles out to protect Boston Harbor. And, is that possibly feasible? Probably not, but some of those out of the box ideas can, sometimes come back to something that might make some sense. And absolutely, it's critical to collaborate on these things, not only between the two communities, but, with all the state agencies and, other communities up and down the coast, and share resources and really start looking at this.
Thank you, Martha.
Would you like me to speak to that as well?
Please.
Yeah, so I think that it would be great for both communities, obviously, to work together moving forward to address these issues. The island was originally developed into and carved into a ton of little lots, right? So there's a substantial amount of development on the island based on the carving of the subdivision plan for the island. On a go-forward basis, I think the Plum Island Turnpike needs to be the priority because it's the primary point of access. We do know, I think, from the discussions we've had with state agencies, local agencies, and representatives, that there are some issues that might prevent harder structures to be put in place to protect the island of the properties in its entirety. But clearly, the access point, I think, is the primary and the first thing to be taking a look at. I think there's some further work definitely needs to be done to look at the overall costs and magnitudes of that. When is the crunch point in which that has to be done? And we don't know exactly what's going to happen in the future, but if scientists are right, and all these projections that we're getting, which are very much in alignment, and as Ellie mentioned, the consultants have used the best available data, in this area to look at the analysis. It's an inconvenient truth, and it's an unfortunate situation because we have these conflicting patterns, right? We have growth and development that's happened on a barrier beach, which is, as one of the speakers mentioned earlier, the folks in the audience had mentioned, this is a reference. The governor had made an executive order related to funding capital projects, if you will, in situations like that, which became an issue when the water and sewer system was run out to the island, because there was concern from the state at that time that might encourage further growth and development on the island, which was already, declared a barrier beach. And it was known that there were obviously erosion issues and so forth. So if the situation is going to get worse, we definitely need to start planning for that. I think we need to be cautious about, certainly homes that are out there. We want to make sure that those homes are protected, that folks can, take care of what they've got out there. But I think it begs the question as to whether or not we want to have any further growth on the island moving forward. And most particularly, we have to make sure that there's access out there. The public health and safety issue, the key one is that the Plum Island Turnpike needs to be accessible in the future. So there's a lot of different pieces to this that would have to be looked at in the future, but I think this is the start of a framework, for that discussion, obviously. And I think that it also puts on everybody's radar the order of magnitude that might be associated with some of the improvements that are necessary to protect the island. And I know that looking at the city of Newburyport bonds on a yearly basis, I don't know if it's realistic to assume that we'll be able to bond the type of numbers that we're talking about this evening. So for instance, whatever that solution is that was mentioned is probably going to take funding from other sources if we're going to do something of that order of magnitude. And granted, those improvements or the work involved might not be done all at once. But for the Plum Island Turnpike, presumably that would be done in some sort of a larger capital project, if that's going to be done. And again, the order of magnitude of that seems pretty large based on the estimates that the consultants had put together based on comparison to other projects.
Thanks so much, Andy, for all those thoughts. There's one question that just came in from Megan that I just thought it was sort of an interesting way to kind of close out this conversation. She says, for those of us that live on the island, what would you advise us? Like, what's the sort of takeaway here? Abandon hope, work to help mitigate, expect help or not, or financial help from municipal or other sources, how to read between the lines. And Megan and everybody, I think, that those are really good questions. I think we kind of are all in this mess trying to kind of work our way out together, but we know enough to know that just this study alone isn't enough to kind of tell us what to do. It starts to give some of the equation of sort of like, here's a way of estimating the pool of resources available. Here's a back of the envelope estimate of what some of the investments could look like. We know there's many other pieces that need to be answered before kind of making decisions. Andy, I don't know if you wanted to chime in to answer that a little more.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to make it clear, because there's always those questions as we talk about these issues. How does this relate to what resources do the municipal officials put into addressing these issues to date and then into the future? I know that during the time that I've been here, there've been a number of city officials, myself, the mayor, Julia Goberts, and others, who have the Ward 1 councilor, Azid, who have constantly gone to MRBA meetings and outside of that met in various different formats to pursue state funding, federal funding and so forth, to try to pursue the permits that are necessary for different initiatives that might be associated with the island. And that comes to the dredging, comes to the sand placement and so forth. In particular, for instance, we think of those projects, but there have again been continued efforts to do that. And I'm sure that there will be continued efforts to better protect the homes that are out there and the island and the access to it and so forth. But what I think is being pointed out here is that the order of magnitude of some of these issues is more than we have dealt with to date. If the projections are right, then we have to prepare more than we have in the past for this issue, and not think of the current status quo as being what we're going to have decades into the future as two communities that share the island. And I think that's the point here, is not that city officials need to continue to do. I think clearly there's enough residents out there, visitors out there and so forth. There's a number of reasons to protect what we can out there. It's just that we are, as one of the commenters mentioned earlier, also fighting against nature, which is a much larger force. Unless we can reverse, sea level rise, which does not appear to be the case based on, scientists' projections, that it's only going to get, exponentially worse, then we do need to start thinking about that more seriously than we have in the past, and making some of those tougher choices about whether it's bonding for projects or limiting, further development or growth out there that beyond what's already out there, things like that. So.
Thanks, Andy. So we're almost at the end of our time here together tonight. Again, just the start of a conversation, and we've now sort of bookmarked many future conversations that we know need to happen. And just to give you a sense of what to expect coming next. So this project team is developing, in consultation with the advisory committee that we mentioned earlier, a final report that will be submitted to the state, which funded this project, and will be available to the public in early July. And so that will both consolidate the learnings from the analysis and also organize some of this community feedback that we've received, especially as sort of pointing towards next steps. And again, we invite you to continue to give us more thoughts in the next week or so via the website. There's a survey that's accessible right from the homepage that asks some similar questions, and also just, gives you an open-ended opportunity to chime in with more thoughts and respond to that yourself. Invite friends to respond, especially if you can get them to first watch this and sort of, have all of the questions that we've been grappling with in their mind as they do. And the recording of the May 24th and tonight's meetings, the May meeting is already on the website, and this one will add probably tomorrow morning. And we'll send that out via email to everybody who signed up to receive updates. So that should make it easy for you to share it forward with your friends. And also just this information will be carried forward after the project ends. So the sort of duration of the grant ends at the end of the fiscal year, at the end of June. But this information will be sort of held by both municipalities and sort of used, we hope, for future planning efforts, future grant applications, et cetera. And so we encourage everybody to sign up on the website to stay in the loop for future developments. Team, any final words in closing?
Thanks,
Just
everyone.
everybody for your participation and active questions, and stay engaged. I think that's the best action forward. So thank you all.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.